Super. Thanks a million, guys, and thanks everybody for attending. It's great. It's kind of funny to see how these events are now very popular to do, seeing as we're all restricted to our houses, but still have to appreciate anybody who turns up to anything on a Saturday. So thanks a million for being here. So what I'm going to chat about, all right, is data analytics. A quick little bit of background about myself. I've basically been working in data for the last 20 years. It's really almost exclusively on the Microsoft platform. There's been a little foray into SAP and Oracle, but generally Microsoft is where I've been at. I do an awful, and from the start, I suppose I've always more been on the data warehouse and business intelligence side of SQL Server. So starting right back with OLAP services in version SQL 7. And then all the way through the various different versions of analysis services and today onto Power BI, tabular, multidimensional, and all the other different parts that go with it. So what I'm going to show you today is basically just it's a demo. It's a demo based around my own experience of working with predominantly Power BI and then integrating Power BI in with other parts of the data platform. The demo I'm going to talk you through is very much real world based. It's very similar to a kind of combination of a couple of different clients of mine. All right. So what we are going to see inside in this session, if my clicker wants to respond to me, is my experience of building reporting solutions with Power BI, etc. And the technologies we're going to be talking about are going to be Power BI, mainly on the Power Query side of things, Power Automate, SharePoint, Office 365, which is now of course called Microsoft 365, and Teams. So if you don't want to see any of that, you're probably in the wrong session, but hopefully you're in the right session. That's what I'm going to be talking about in here. Let's talk briefly about my demo. Most of this is going to be very demo based. I only have a few slides. I want to combine budget sales, company sales, and retail sales. A client of mine came along to me with this exact request where he says, we've got our company sales sitting inside an ERP system. We have our budget sitting in, guess what? Excel. And then because they are a company who sells into wholesalers who subsequently then sell into retailers, or else they sell directly to retailers who sell it out to consumers, they are also in the retail. They're also interested in the retail sales angle of their company, and that information is sent. So they've got three sources of data. They want to create some reports for users. Company sales from an ERP sales, they actually get from Excel files that are sent from what we call data aggregators, so companies that basically aggregate data from different shops, and budget data, which you had inside in their own Excel. So that was the challenge. That was the ask. All right. It's a fairly regular ask. It's a fairly standard kind of requirement out there, be it across an organization or within a department or even for an individual. So before I get into the actual demo itself, let's talk a little bit about Power BI and data projects 101, as I call it. Most data projects fall into this. 4 key parts to it. You got to get your data out of a system. All right. So in the Power BI world, we're going to use Power Query, or you can call it M, or you can call it Get Data, or you can call it Transform. It's got a few different names out there. You then want to model our data. So when I say model in data, typically the shape of data in our source system does not necessarily suit what the shape that we need for reporting. Or in this case, it's in 3 different source systems, so we got to bring it into the one model anyway. It's always a very important part of a data project, and Power BI Desktop is where we're doing a model in here. From a visualization point of view, we're in Power BI Desktop and using PowerBI.com, and then from a sharing point of view, we're using PowerBI.com. So that's the kind of the 101 approach when you're approaching data. Lots of projects fall into this mode. Yes, not all. Some BI data projects don't need to worry about getting data. They can just go straight back to a data source because maybe the data source is in a good enough shape already, or maybe the data source is an analysis services cube. But I suppose when it comes to the whole mashup side of things in there, you're typically back in the get, model, visualize, and share. So a lot of what I'm going to be showing you is simply evolving around those 4 parts of a data project. So let's look at my phase 1, kind of the first time I did this project per se, the first time you might approach a project yourself. I've got 3 phases to show you. So phase 1 is all really just about modeling it, doing it in Power BI. So Power BI is kind of the only show in town here. You're using Power Query to get your data out. You're going to model data, you're going to visualize data, and you're going to share in PowerBI.com. your architecture is going to look a little bit like this. So these are my 3 data sources that I have: budget, an ERP system, and a retail sales system. I've also introduced in a 4th data source, which is just necessary for this particular client. And so I figured I'd leave it in because of the fact that the retail sales data that comes to them, it uses retail product codes, your barcode that basically is on the packaging, whereas the product codes that they use internally are a completely different set of product codes. So all that really master data is doing is maintaining a data map between one and the other. On the right-hand side over here, we've got PowerBI.com, the service, which is what basically people are going to be connecting to when they want to run their reports. And that bit in the middle is the Enterprise Gateway Connector. So this is an additional component that you'll typically have to install into a lot of data projects if you're connecting to on-premise data sources. And it basically allows the Power BI service to communicate with on-premise services via this gateway connector. So that's a phase 1 approach onto it. So let's have a look at what that looks like in a demo world. So I'll be swapping some screens in and out in here, guys. I just want to do a check back. Everybody can hear me. The pacing is okay. Yeah, I know sometimes as a Corkonian, I can speak incredibly quickly, so I'm trying to slow it down for you.
No, it's all good, Mark.
Super. Thank you. So let's have a quick look at my data sources in here, okay? I haven't actually set up an ERP system in here, but I am going to use a database. So I've got a SQL Server sitting on my VM in here, right? And I'm going to be interested in some of those particular tables. In particular, I'm going to be interested in these guys down here, my invoice lines and my invoices, okay? What else have we got going on in here? So I mentioned that we got various Excel files in there. So let's look at those retail files. Well, our retail files, they look a little bit like when they look a little bit like this when they come in. They're basically just a set of data with a product code, a brand, and then some data inside there, okay? So my retail sales look a little bit like that. I mentioned that we had a budget in here as well. So here's my budget laid out in my favorite way that I see budgets laid out by accountants. And I always curse and give out because I kind of go, columns are horrible. But this is typically how I see a lot of budgets, where there'll be products going down here or customers down here, and right across on the right-hand side, lots of columns showing all of those different numbers that we have. So that's my budget side. I mentioned too, and I want to mention briefly, just that I had a master data table, and it's a cheap and cheerful solution that was just currently sitting inside an Excel sheet, or at the start it was anyway. And all it is it's just maintaining a list basically between a product code that comes on my retail file and my corresponding code that I should use for it internally. So they're kind of my my data sources that I'm flicking through. So if I was starting this from scratch, we're obviously going to be inside in Power BI. I'm not going to talk you through the whole building of the solution, but let's, in case you haven't seen how Power BI works or how Power Query works, let's get a quick flavor of how we would start doing this, okay? And typically that's going to start with a blank page, and you're going to go up and you're going to get your data, and I'm going to go and get my data from my budget sheet this time. So I'm going to click in there. I'm going to select my budget sheet. I'm going to open it up. And what happens here is it's going to open up Power Query Transform in a couple of seconds after a dramatic pause. And I'm seeing in here that, okay, I've got tabs and data tables inside in here. Okay, so I can click on my data table. It gives me my little preview of what's going on. It always gives you such a tempting yellow button to kind of go, let's just load that data, but rarely loading is rarely good enough at this point. I'm often going into hit the actual transform. So into the transform world, and for now, pretend you're not seeing all this lovely stuff over on the left-hand side. Okay, this is the stuff that's been built already, and let's just focus on this one thing that's happened in here. And we've noticed a couple of things already. Obviously, I'm seeing the data that's inside my Excel sheet, and if I look over here, I'm seeing various different steps that have appeared. And this is Power Query in action. Okay, this is Power Query. It's a step-by-step process of transforming your data. So I can replace those steps from inside here, where I'm kind of going, all right, that was my source. I went to an Excel sheet. I navigated out. I selected a particular sheet. I promoted my headers, and I did a bit of change in data types. You probably didn't even realize I was doing all that stuff, but that's kind of what happened out of the box. So now the next thing in here is going, well, this is still not in a suitable shape for me. So I'll have to do a little bit more transformation work to put that into a shape. One thing I want to get rid of these columns. So I'm going to select all of those columns. and I'm going to go into transform, and I'm going to unpivot. So now straight away, I've got something that looks a little bit more like a fact table, to use a Kimball term, of what my data should look like. I can see in here now I've got an SKU and a stock code. I probably don't need that SKU code in there anymore, right? So let's just remove that column out of here. I have a stock code. I'm happy with that. Over in here, I've got a calendar unpivoted. So I'm going to stick with this guy in here. And then over in here, maybe I'm going to turn around and change the name of that. Okay. And I might also want to do a little bit of setting a bit more budget data types. So I might change that into a decimal number. And now what's happened on the right hand side over here is I've just simply added on some more steps while I've been doing that. Okay, so it gets to my final data shape. And in fact, if you wanted to see the code behind that, it's available. But if I want to click on Advanced Editor up here, you can see along here that this is the actual M code that's being generated to do all of these transformations. And I'll be coming back to that in a minute or two. So I just wanted to show you that. So now I've got and the final thing you probably typically would do in this table is you're going to give it a more friendlier name. All right, my budget going on there. So now I've got my query built up over here. Now, by extending that out, you should eventually end up with a shape that looks a little bit like above, all right? And I've got some folders organized up here, right? Because I like thinking of data in context of dimensions and facts. So the way I tend to build them in there is I kind of going, okay, I've got in here, I've got a folder that contains all of my fact tables. I have another one that contains my dimension tables, and I've got another table that's got reference queries, all right? So if I was to go looking at my facts in here, I can see in here, well, I've got basically 3 different fact tables, one about company sales, one about retail sales, and one about budget sales. And you can see my budget one from here is very, very similar to the quick bit of transformations that I've done already. And say if I just take one more of them as an example, if I was to look at company sales, over on my right hand side, I've got my little connectors going on. So I sourced, I expanded, and I changed a data type. And if I just look at that source, you can kind of read it off the top in here if you wanted, all right? But it's basically combining something called invoice lines with invoice headers. Or if I was to expand this, there's my invoice lines, and it's picked up on my invoice ID, and here's my invoice headers and another invoice, and I'm basically doing a left join on those 2 tables to bring them together. Which brings me back to my reference queries. And up in here, you can see these are my reference queries where I got my basic, I've basically written a query to pull out my invoice header and my invoice lines, and they themselves are very, very simple little queries. Now, this isn't the only way you can approach doing it, all right? I've just deliberately kind of set things up in here that I want to show how queries can reference other queries. You could write a straight SQL statement to get the data out as well. But looking at over here, you can now see my replay steps of source, navigation, and removing columns. So that was my source, seeing all of my database tables. Navigated out to pick out the particular invoices. Then I realized I didn't want most of these headers, so I removed to be left with the shape that I wanted. So that's a little bit about how you're doing the Power Query side of things, okay? Where you want to get to, having done all that, is you want to skip over into my modeling world. So if I click into here, here's my model, all right? So inside in here, I've got company sales, and I can see how company sales has a relationship going on to customers, and also how company sales got a relationship going on to product, and finally how company sales got a relationship going on to calendar in there as well. On the retail sales side of things, I can see again how I'm related to calendar. I've also got a relationship to customers. I got a relationship to product. If I go looking at my budget side of things, I can see, okay, in my budget, I've got a relationship to my calendar side of things, and I've got a relationship to my product. But I don't have any direct relationship going on to my customers because I'm not budgeted by customers in this case. I'm just purely product-focused organization. So this is my data model that I want to get to. And having got to that data model, you will hopefully end up in a situation where you can come along and go, okay, well, I've now got over here various fields that are available to me. So I can turn around and start putting up a table and turn around and say, okay, let's look at my budget. Let's compare that to my company sales. So let's look at my company sales, and we kind of see how I am getting data together. do whatever type of work you want to start doing with it. I want to start splitting that over say years, etc., etc., and you start building up that picture that you want to get to. Okay. So you end up hopefully with some spectacular visualization, hopefully an awful lot better than my visualizations that I've built in here. Here's my attempt at a visualization. And I suppose again, just to call out, obviously it's Power BI, so you get that very click nature where you can kind of click on one thing and we start getting the cross filtering happening going on. All right. And I want to draw your attention to one particular number, which is this number, my 34,000 number up here, because hopefully this will update for us automatically later on. All right. So having got to here, you're going to do publish. You'll end up going down, publishing it to Power BI. Yes, I'll save my changes. I'll apply it later. And after a couple of seconds, it will connect in and I should see my tenant. And in there, I can go ahead and publish this if I want. Now, I'm not going to actually do the publication here because it's already been taken care of, but that will put it up. So from a development point of view, I've kind of developed my solution now, right? So great. So let's look at that solution. Sorry, now I'm just going to drag over a browser to our screen. So to get to that, you'll log into Power BI. And inside in Power BI, and this is the new look of it actually, if people haven't seen it before, and there you used to see more tabs going across, whereas now they've grouped things into something called data sets and data flows and content, okay? But if I go into my content side of things in here, I can see I've got a sales V1 report. I go clicking on this report, and I'm getting up to my same report that I saw before. And this brings me back to my 34K figure that I was talking about. So it's all published up. If I was to look at the other parts in there, the other side of that goes with it is I've got this data set has been created. So when I published from Power BI, it took my file, put it up to Power BI, split it into basically a data set and to a report. Here's the data set of it. And if we look at our refresh in there, you can see actually that the last time I did a refresh is there. If I just refresh this page, that should do an update. So you can see that the last time this refreshed was my little test refresh that I did earlier this morning, just to make sure that all is working in there. So as such, I've kind of ended up with my 3 data sets combined and published. So let's go back and kind of critique that a little bit as a first pass. So we did our modeling. This is our architecture. We went through our demo. What I've ended up with in here is a single Power BI solution. I would call it effective, but it's very standalone. It's kind of just sitting there on its own inside in Power BI. It's not really integrated in with my organization in any manner. Yes, I can share out links and people can connect onto it, but it still feels a little bit disconnected, right? Also, I had a little bit of additional data maintenance to make it work in there as well with this master data. This is real life, so this exists currently. But even that whole solution feels very awkward because I ended up creating an Excel sheet that they now have to maintain somewhere. And we all know Excel sheets aren't exactly the greatest thing to be using as a pure data source because people can change them, delete them, etc. So there's definitely kind of some holes in here. So let's look at phase 2. I'll just do a quick stop there. Any, again, pacing is okay. Have any questions popped up, Kevin?
No questions at the moment, Mark. No, you're playing a blinder.
Super. Okay, so let's look at phase 2. So redesign and start leveraging Office in here. So again, Power BI is going to play a role up in here, but I want to introduce data flows. Okay, so data flows is what I call about the concept of sharing data. Power BI, you're sharing a report, right? Whereas a data flow, you're sharing just data. And the classic example of this is you saw me do a bit of work in Power BI to bring in company sales. Okay, so now the next time my client brought me in, they said, we need you to do another bit of work. Great. But for various reasons, some of them political, some of them practical, they wanted it to be in a completely different Power BI solution. Okay, a completely different Power BI data set, which throws up the question kind of going, well, I've done a bit of work here to bring in your company sales. If I now have to do another solution in another Power BI desktop model, I'm going to have to bring in all that company sales data again, right? And now I'm going to have code sitting in 2 locations, which just doesn't really feel like a good idea. Okay. And obviously it's not a good idea because you find an issue, you got to fix it in 2 different places. And that can get worse and worse in 3 and 4 and 5 and 10 different places. So data flows is an opportunity to turn around and say, well, actually, I've got this concept. I've got this entity called company sales. I want to make that available up on Power BI so that any other model that needs it can go to the one location and get it. And now I've got my code in the one spot. I want to bring Excel in here as well because that whole Power BI experience of putting up things is very, very visual based up on PowerBI.com. But if you want to get real ad hoc-y with your data, sometimes Excel is a great tool. So let's bring that in there. And then as well, because my organization is already on Microsoft 365, and this is, well, why don't I use some of the components you already have, such as SharePoint and Teams, to give you different visualizations, to make it bring it closer to your to the end users, and to give you a better way of, frankly, maintaining data. Okay, so we're adding on quite a few things in phase 2. So my architecture now looks a bit like this. I still have my 3 data sources, they haven't changed, but I've lost this master data Excel because that just felt so awkward, right? Instead, I've replaced it with SharePoint list. My gateway connector still exists, obviously. Power BI itself still exists going on there. But now, as opposed to people getting to it directly via their browsers, which they can continue to do so, I'm also giving them an option to start viewing data directly inside in SharePoint, and also that they can connect to it inside in Excel or in via Teams as well. So I'm trying to bring that data more central to their organization as opposed to a little island out by itself. So let's have a look at this one. So if I was to connect back to here, so I'm going back to Power BI, I want to start talking about that data flow first. All right, so we said in here, this tab now contains data sets and data flows. And there was my data set that I had created. But if I look up in here, I've got something called company sales and a different little icon over here, and it says the type, it's a data flow. So if I go into this, click on company sales, brings me into this entity called company sales. Underneath it, I see the data types that this is going to return. If I wanted to go looking at the details behind this, it's going to bring me into Power Query. It actually names it here, Power Query on the cloud. And I'm getting pretty much the same experience as I saw on Power BI desktop. I've got all my transforms are available to me in here. I've got my shape of data that I'm looking at in here, and over here I've got my data source steps that I'm applying to get to it. This is now a separate little data object that exists. It can be refreshed independently of your model, which in itself can be very useful because maybe there's certain parts of your data model where you say, I only need this to refresh weekly, but other parts need to refresh daily. So it kind of gives you a way of achieving that. And what it actually does is when it does a refresh, it stores your data in a blob object in a Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. Okay. If you don't specify it, it puts it into its own Gen 2 data lake storage. But actually, if you want to, you can set it up so that Power BI will put it into your own data lake Gen 2 storage, which kind of is an interesting little use case in there that you could almost use Power Query now as a way of getting data into your data lake through this mechanism. And all it is basically a text blob object that you can then pick up and work away with in the data lake environment. As a benefit of doing this too, purely it's maybe more from a development point of view, but if you're developing in Power BI desktop and you're making changes and you do a refresh, every time it has to refresh the model or at the very least a bit of data that you're looking at. That might be very quick, but that could also be a significantly long process. And part of the reason, if you're using a data flow, that often can be significantly faster because one, you may not need to refresh the data flow. It's just sitting up there. So all that's actually happening from a Power BI desktop point of view is it's just pulling down the blob object, which typically tends to be a lot faster than necessarily going back to a data source and applying all of your transforms. All right. So that's the data flow up in the cloud. And to actually get that onto your model, I am now going to close this one down. And apologies, I hadn't opened this up earlier, so I'm going to have to chat on for about 30 seconds while it opens it up. Put in my second version of the model in here. I have made some changes, so ignore that visual for now. We'll edit my queries. And let's look what it looks like. Well, to begin with, actually, even before I show you this, let's just go back to the model to see has it changed. And the model hasn't changed, right? Because I was actually happy with my model. It did what I needed to do. It allowed me to analyze my data by different dimensions. But it's the way I populated the model has changed somewhat. So to begin with, let's go to company sales. So the last time, if I remember company sales, I had several steps along here, whereas now I've just got two. If I click on that top one, go to source, you can see how it's referring to Power BI data flows. So it's no longer referring to those reference queries I created. In fact, if I look at my reference queries, you can see now I've got a lot less reference queries going on. So if I was starting from scratch to get that data in, I will be going to new data source, and going to go to more, to the Power Platform. I can see in here I got Power BI data flows. Do connect. It browses onto my data flows that I have in here already, and I can connect in, see Reboot your analytics. There's my company sales data flow. Click on that. It's running on my preview, and over here, it's giving me what I'm going to see in there. So I can then turn around and load in that data. So very, very straightforward to get your data flow. Minimal additional code created inside my Power BI desktop. Overall, a good thing. A couple of other things have changed in here as well. What I hadn't shown you, I obviously had to, because I mentioned my master data, I had made a connection to an Excel sheet, whereas now in those, you can see that these are connecting to SharePoint. I've just put an SP in front of them instead, just to indicate that they are SharePoint connections. And anything else then that needs them is referring to those. So that gives you an idea of a little bit of rework on the back end while keeping my actual data model the same way. So my data model is still happy, but then I've ended up connecting to my data flows, connecting to my SharePoint. When I go publishing that off, publishing would be the same as normal. You put up into powerbi.com, but now I want to go looking at what I've created. So before I was just talking about Power BI, but now I want to go to SharePoint. So I've created a SharePoint page in here now. And on this one, you can see the front page you go to is very visual, and there's that wonderful 34K figure that I mentioned already. And I'm up in a SharePoint world, so I can click on it. It's all interactive as you would expect inside in here. I can change my filters. I can do my normal things that I would expect. But it feels to me that I've put it a bit closer to my organization straight away, because obviously I'm in SharePoint, so there can be a hell of a lot of other things in here. I can have other document libraries in here, other types of things, all that SharePoint Online stuff. And what have I also put in here? I've put in these lists. So that master data that I had been maintaining inside an Excel, I have now put into a SharePoint list. Okay, so there's my data going across, mapping this code over to that code. But having done it this way, it feels a lot more secure, right? Because one, I can secure up that list so only certain people can edit it. Its shape is much less likely to change, unless obviously they go in and edit lists, and they'd have to have permissions to that. Overall, it feels like a lot more of a kind of a secure way of doing things for me. Okay. I also mentioned I wanted to kind of bring it even potentially closer again, because this is again to the SharePoint side of things. I will mention these other charts at the top, by the way. And I suppose it's just to kind of go, it no longer has to be just about one thing in there. So while this is all coming from my data model, and in fact, so are these guys, so is this guy, these guys over here are actually Twitter feeds. So for the last year and a half or so, I've been capturing the hashtag Brexit and running it through a cognitive services sentiment. And this is a sentiment over time. It's a real 50-50 game. At the moment, it's just slightly positive. Okay, actually earlier today it was quite positive. Often it's negative, so it kind of bounces around because I'm just looking at the average sentiment over the last 10 tweets there. So I can add more than just my one data model inside here in this environment. I've mentioned Teams. So what if we've adopted Teams, which obviously we're on a Teams call at the moment, and Teams is getting huge adoption at the moment inside organizations. So when you're inside in Teams, typically this is the type of interface you may have. You can have several teams going on. I've got a team here called Reboot. When I go in, I'm seeing here, okay, I got my posts, my files, my wikis, all the other things that you can add into a team's area. And then I've got this tab called Sales V1. And what that is doing is connecting me to my Power BI report that I have in the cloud. And it's, again, interactive, click around the place, change parameters. Plus, in this case, I can start having conversations with people, okay? So if I wanted to go along and say to some user in there, you can actually have that kind of dialogue with them directly inside a chat window, and they'll get a notification of that actually going on there, and they can respond to you in there. So I've really kind of started changing the feel of how I interact with reports in here now to bring it much, much closer to the daily go-to applications that my customers will be using. And then I also spoke about what if I wanted to get very kind of heavy with my with my analysis, go beyond my reports up there. Obviously, I can create reports inside in Power BI. So typically the way a person might do this, they might be in their own workspace. They can turn around and go, oh, I'm going to create a new report. And inside there, they'll go looking for their report. And I'll see one in here. I'll see my Sales V1. I'll click on Create. So now I'm inside in a edit environment up in the cloud, and I can turn around in there. And as I did before, I can come along and click on my budget data, and I'll choose to look at that by product this time, by brand. It's all my same brand, obviously. So there you go. I'm getting now my budget data begin to come back out. And this is great, and you can save this off and you can publish up on PowerBI.com, and it's available to you. But sometimes maybe you just want to get a bit closer with the data again. All right, so I'm clicking over here and I've got this Analyze in Excel option. When I click on Analyze in Excel, it does a download for me here. Okay, if I click on this, this opens up in Excel. I'm going to enable this control. Apologies, I will have to re-authenticate. I'll just do that over here. So that's authenticating me. And now I'm in a pivot table. There's a pivot table that's connected to my data set up in the cloud. And I can turn around and just start using it like any other pivot table that you would use. Click on data, click on brands, go around, change my layout of it. You probably want that in the tabular form, etc., etc. It's a pivot table. So I've now allowed a user to go straight up to that data set and work in a completely ad hoc environment down on a tool that they'll probably be very comfortable with already, especially if they've been using things like VLOOKUPs and pivot tables all their lives, which a lot of these people have. Okay. So popping back onto here. So redesigned, brought in my data flows, brought in Excel, brought in ad hoc, brought in SharePoint. This is my architecture I end up with in there. If I was to critique that, there's a lot of pluses in here now. I've got a single data source for multiple models. So I use company sales as my example, but you can see how you can extend that out onto other ones. I'm using SharePoint for online data maintenance, which feels a lot safer to me. I've got a SharePoint dashboard that users can go to. They can use their pivot tables as well, and you can go teams in there as well. So I think phase 2 has brought a much more kind of rounded solution to the client. So let's go looking at phase 3. So phase 3, I just wanted to bring in an automation. There's kind of a glaring little hole going on in this solution at the moment, which is those retail sales files were sent by email, okay? Which means there's a person inside waiting for the email to come through once a week, and then they have to detach the files, put it onto a file share, and trigger a refresh. Okay, so there's manual work in there, and obviously the person goes on holidays, and they haven't handed over their duty, and no one could log on to their email, and then you're a couple of weeks without your data. So again, a little bit of a rough edge in there. So what can we do about that? So this is where I want to bring in Power Automate for automation, orchestration, and workflow. Lots of other cool stuff it can do as well. And this is what my architect like now. What else is saying going around here, except I've got this new angle in here where I've created a automate task, which is monitoring my email. When it receives a certain type of email, it will drop my retail file onto a file share, and also it will call a refresh of Power BI. While I'm in there, I decided, hey, let's do some other things with Flow in there, and because monitoring tweets or you want to watch your brands or etc., I decided let's do my connector to Twitter and load that into somewhere as well. Let's have a demo of that. So this is Flow. So flow.microsoft.com. Well, it's now called Power Automate, but to connect with it's still flow.microsoft.com. I've got a few flows in here already. So I'm going to look at this one, save my attachment and refresh. So we can see the last times this is run. So these are the last few times I've done this demo. So hopefully it's all going to run automatically for me again. That's succeeded so far. I go looking at the edit of this. And this is the whole low code, no code approach of Microsoft in here. So I've got three things happening when an email arrives. So when an email arrives, let's have a look at this, all right? So to begin with, it's connecting to a connection. So I've given it my Office 365 account so I can get to my emails. It's going to monitor my inbox. And then there's a few more things going on here. It's looking for emails that come from my Gmail account. And I've also got a filter on the subject header that it has to contain the word reboot inside in the subject. So it's not going to trigger for every single email I receive. Once that trigger kicks in, it then does an apply to each operator. So it applies to each attachment on my file. And what does it apply? Well, it does a create file. So it creates a file which needs another connection. So this is a connection to something called Reboot Retail Sales. So when I spoke about that on-premise gateway connector, we spoke about it in the mode of it was pulling data off on-premise to put into Power BI. It can also go the other way, where you can use something like Power Automate to say, having got something in the cloud or something having some trigger having happened, I want to push data through that gateway connector to put it back onto on-premise. All right. So that Reboot Retail Sales is literally a connection to a file share via my enterprise gateway connector. So having detached the files and put it on there, the last thing then that I want to happen is I then want to trigger off a refresh of my work on my workspace of my Sales V1. So that's my flow. I have a couple of other flows in there as well. Just have a quick look at them. There's another one in here called my sentiment analysis. So if I'm looking at this, so this time is using a different connector. When a tweet is posted, so again, you have to put up your connections onto what account. So I'm going onto my own Twitter account in there. I'm looking for anything that comes up on Brexit. I'm then doing a connection. I'm then doing a detect sentiment connection. So this is going to be a connection to my cognitive services connection. And having done all that, I then want to insert data into a SQL database. So that's my table name I'm putting it into. And there's yet another connection going on down there, which is connecting it into an Azure SQL server. As we can see in there, and despite the fact that it's actually saying my connection is incorrect, it's actually fine. It's been running away there, and it's done several runs already today. So let's go back to my first flow and see, can we trigger it now? So over here inside my Gmail, I've got an email all ready to go, delivered to myself. I got reboot into subject header, and alongside with that, I've got two attachments, the September files for my two brands that I'm offering my two retailers. So we'll do a send on that. So that's gone. And what I'm expecting to happen in here now, and normally this takes something in the regions of 30 seconds to run, but what should be happening there is my retail sales folder should increase and get a new one. So I've just heard a beep in the background there, which is my email being received, and I'm hoping this, and there we go. September has appeared and September has appeared. So that flow has now run. It's dropped those files onto my network share. It also should have triggered off a Power BI build. So let's go back and see, are we in time to see that? And it's run. So if we look here at my update, you can see now that has done an update for me there just now. So the last bit of testing on this one is if I go back to my reboot, I do a refresh on my SharePoint, or if I did it via my Teams or wherever I wanted to go to look at my report, my 34K figure has now gone up to 39K. So I've actually managed to successfully automate that whole process. So this can just run away now automatically. And let's put back up this. So this is the automate. And obviously, look, it's picked off an important part of kind of closing off the gap in this solution. So now I can actually turn around to the client and go, you've pretty much got an end-to-end solution now. We've worked out the automation phase. We've created a model. We've got second models. We know we're not sharing code between them anymore. We've got single objects going on. We're using SharePoint to maintain your master data. You're now trained on how to use your existing reports that have been created. You can create your own ones in Power BI. You can get dirty with ad hoc data inside an Excel. You've got a SharePoint page that you can go to access along with other company data, or if you're a Teams fan, you can do it via the Teams side in there. So now it feels like a much more end-to-end kind of a enterprise level solution for me. And we had a little bit of fun with sentiment in there as well. Phase 4, I'm not going to demo anything in here. This is more just kind of talking about really what happened over time, and that happened over the last couple of years for me because very launches and you start taking advantage of stuff. And I suppose this is very close to what you would get in a solution now based upon Microsoft Power Platform. I haven't used all parts of it at all, but we've certainly seen now that we've used the Power BI aspect of it. We've seen the Power Automate aspect of it. We've seen how the data connectors are being used both in a two-way manner. We've seen how portals can be created. I haven't spoken about AI Builder and Common Data Service. Power Apps I haven't spoken about, and Power Virtual Agents, because I mean I have never used them, but you can see how they could potentially be integrated, and how Power Apps is like a form builder for you to give further levels of integration. And then that's all backing on to SharePoint using Excel, Office 365, and if you're a Dynamics customer, you can even get a further level of integration by embedding reports directly inside your Dynamics environment in there as well, and that's got a significant tie-in with the Common Data Service in there as well. So really, that's the whole kind of Power BI platform in use and a demo of some aspects of it. So conclusions. If I was to look back at what was done, underneath this, obviously, we can address lots of report and analytical needs. This comes up, and I find Power BI and Power Platform is fascinating in that it's the type of product that I see business users using without IT being involved, which is great and terrifying. This is largely based on one particular client of mine, and the CFO was the guy who contacted me, right? And the dialogue was very much along the lines of, heard about you, can we come in and can we have a chat about data? So it's great. I was assuming we were going in to do a data 101 kind of workshop. Let's talk about options in there. And after the first 10 minutes, he kind of stopped and says, yeah, but we're doing it in Power BI, right? He had already got the download done, all right? So you don't have to be IT to do a lot in here. Having said that, look, data projects can be complex. Modeling can get complex. You can have many-to-many relationships going in there. You can have questions about distinct counts. You might have to go in to start ordering some sophisticated DAX or some sophisticated M. So while you can do a lot without being IT, it certainly helps if you have IT going on there. You could already own a lot of this stuff. A lot of people out there already have Office 365. So as such, they own things like Excel, obviously, and Teams and SharePoint. So they can start piggybacking that on and even automate. So they can start piggybacking that on into an existing Power BI solution without incurring an additional cost. Speaking of cost, I mean, it's software as a service. So the way I look at this, it can get expensive or it can be amazingly cost effective. Okay, I have clients who turn over millions. They're not small organizations, but they only have 5 or 6 users who'll ever want to actually get into this type of analysis. Prior to Power Platform world, you're having a conversation around a Microsoft SQL Server on-premise enterprise license, which starts off somewhat expensive straight away. Now the conversation can be, okay, 5 or 6 users, that's going to cost you 5 or 6 multiplied by 850 per user per month, right? It's a completely different dynamic, completely different conversation. Obviously, if you've got 1,000 users, then you're going to go, well, hang a second, 850 by 1,000 isn't so cheap. But then we can maybe start talking about Power BI Premium, or maybe there's other options in there. So to be aware of it. And that's the end of my conclusions in there, actually. Kind of kept them brief and to the point. I will be delighted if you had any questions. I'd also value your feedback. You can scan that QR code if you want, or you can go to datasmart.ie/eval. And my cheeky plug is going to be, this is a weekend event going on, and it's been going on during the week. There's another event going on next weekend called dataweekender.com. And we got 42 sessions going on all sorts of different data platform topics. So if you're interested, you might want to check that out, or certainly help spread the word. So that's the end of my session, guys. I got about 10 to the hour, so we can probably take a couple of questions, or like Amy beforehand, I can stay on in the chat room and answer that way. Thanks very much, guys. Back over to you there, Kevin.